The news from Lake Wobegon is brought to you by Total Cereal. All 6 flavors provide 100% daily value of at least 11 essential vitamins and minerals. Total, 100% nutrition.
Well, it's been a quiet week in Lake Wobegon, Minnesota, my hometown, out on the edge of the prairie. It's been quiet because it's been cold. Had a big frost here, and the first snow fell, and a big wind came up on Monday and blew for a whole day. People lay in their houses, sat at the kitchen table, and they could hear the houses creak around them, and they could hear the branches beating against them, and they could hear the rope, that heavy cable on the flagpole down in the middle of town in front of the statue of the unknown Norwegian was whipping against it, and the wind was powerful. It blew stuff around. Clarence and Arlene Bunsen found an empty bottle of champagne in their front yard. They didn't know who that was. It was a French champagne, and they found a book of favorite love poems, and their garbage can blew away, and it had 10 years of tax statements that Arlene had just thrown away, and she'd thrown away a whole bunch of her own underwear, so somebody's looking at that somewhere and thinking, gosh, I thought they made more money than that. I never knew Arlene wore that size. Goodness, she has put on weight, hasn't she? The wind blew out the power. A wire came down somewhere, and so we were without power for a little bit there on late on Tuesday, and people lit candles. They sat and they read by candlelight. They played some games. And if you walked down the street and you looked into people's windows, which you should not do, but nonetheless people do it all the time, you could see in a few houses back there, you could see in the light of candles the shadows of people who seemed to be wrestling on couches. They were wrestling and writhing, and things were going on that you didn't want to look at, and yet you did look at, and you watched. This is what happens even in a small town when we lose the electronic media. We look for other natural media, such as the medium of the voice or the medium of skin, the touching of skin. We are formal people in Lake Wobegon, and we were brought up to be, and we still are, and we believe in ritual, and we have no ritual for this whatsoever, so it's purely something that happens by accident. But when it does, wow, it really appeals to people. Other skin on your skin, and sometimes a great deal of skin. This is what can happen. And then the power came back, and then it was gone, unfortunately. One could hope for this to happen more often. The moths were clustered, clumped in around the porch lights, and evidently they like that feeling of skin, or whatever they have. Wings beating on wings. You wanted to tell them, go off and enjoy yourselves. You don't have much life left. But obviously they were enjoying themselves, just all clumped in together. It didn't make sense to us, but it made sense to them. Reformation Sunday, on Sunday, celebrating October 31st, 1517, when Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the church door at Wittenberg, his protest against the Catholic Church. Scriptura sola, fide sola, gratia sola. Scripture alone, faith alone, grace alone. Pastor Liz was trying to come up with a sermon for this, sitting around Friday morning when there was a knock on the parsonage door, and a couple walked in who she did not know, an odd-looking couple, very pale and very black hair, short man and kind of a tall woman with her hair in braids, and they walked in and they wanted to have a baby baptized. Well, Liz didn't know who they were. She asked them why, and there was the baby, and they had a child. It was about 6 weeks old, tiny child with a kind of a sharp nose and dark eyes. And it looked very perceptive for a small child. Well, they said because they were on the road, they were driving west to Seattle, and they had a vision. They wanted the child to be baptized. Well, she would never say no to anybody. She said, "Do you have godparents?" No, they didn't have anybody to be godparents, to be the spiritual security of this baby. Well, she said, "I'll find you some." So she called up Clint and Irene Bunsen, and they came over. They didn't have anything else to do. And they said, well, how are we going to be godparents? Through prayer, she said, just mainly prayer. We just promised to pray for this child every Sunday, at least, in church, and more often if you think about it. So she went up to get her alb on, and she went up to get her tools of baptism, and she came down and did the deed right there in the living room and said all the prayers and the responses, and evil was renounced, and the faith was proclaimed, and the faith in the Holy Spirit and the faith in the resurrection, and she swashed the water onto the child's head. The child looked up calmly, and she wiped off the head, and they got in their car, and they drove away. And it wasn't for a few minutes that she discovered that she was missing a picture of her father in a gold frame and an old family Bible, and about $150 had been taken out of her purse and a couple of silver candlesticks. Well, she got in her car, and she drove west, and she found them. After about 10 miles, their car was pulled over to the side, and the hood was up, and the man was standing by the car with his thumb out, and the moment Liz pulled up, he reached into the car, and he pulled out a brown paper sack and handed it over to her. Well, she could tell that they were low on cash, the way they were dressed. The woman was crying. The baby looked perfectly silent, perfectly blessed, already a child of faith. She handed back the $150 to the man. She said, "You keep this." She took the pictures, she took the candlesticks and the Bible. He said, "Thank you. You're very good. Could you give me a lift into town to get some gas?" She did. Drove into Bunsen Motors. Clint was there, and he lent the man a 5-gallon can and filled it up. Wouldn't take money for her. Liz said, "What do you do for a living?" Man said, "I'm a musician." Got back to the car, he put the gas in the car, and he reached into the trunk, and he pulled out 6 beer bottles, which were all tied together with bungee cords. And blowing into the beer bottles, he played Beethoven's Ode to Joy. And he played Amazing Grace, How Sweet the Sound That Saved a Wretch Like Me. She got that on her cell phone, on her video camera. She got him playing Amazing Grace. It really was amazing. And she was watching it as she drove back home. She was looking at it on her little screen, and that's when she hit the deer. The deer was just suddenly there. This form was just suddenly there in front of her car. No time to put on the brakes. She just hit it, and there was a big whoomp, a big lurch, and her airbag blew up in her face, and the deer was dead. She got a tire iron out of her trunk. She was prepared to kill him, but the deer was dead. She managed to pick him up and stuff him into her trunk. And she drove back into town. She drove up to Bunsen Motors. She said, "Do you know anybody who can butcher this for me?" Clint said, "My, this has been a day of adventure for you, hasn't it? Well, he happened to know his brother-in-law Leland does that, so Leland came to the rectory, to the garage, hung the deer up, he gutted it, cleaned it, and he just took one leg for his payment, and she ground up the venison to make sausage, and she got back to work on her Reformation Sunday sermon. It's the beginning of deer hunting season this next week, and Clint is a deer hunter. He got his rifle out after he saw that deer hit by the car. He got his rifle out when he went home for lunch, and he sat there at the table cleaning it and looking right straight down the barrel. He knows that gets her goat, Irene. She's horrified. She says, "How can you do that? How can you do that? How can you go off and it's their mating season, for heaven's sake." Male deer who are all excited and full of hormones, and they sense that there's a woman nearby, a female, and then suddenly they smell beer and they turn and they look, and there's a man with a long iron arm and blows their brains out. I mean, how would you feel? He said, "I wouldn't feel anything." It's exactly how most men would want to go if they had a choice. To be all excited and full of hormones, and you smell a woman, and the woman is near, and you're just about to get lucky, and then the lights go out. She doesn't understand hunting. She doesn't understand football or any of those things. Football, it's just like a boot camp for bozos. Her son went out for football. Her husband is a big football fan. The son's coach told them, whatever you set your mind to do, you can do it, which is demonstrably not true. And that team lost 7 games that season. They were 0-7. Made a scar on that kid. That kid got darker because of that losing season. She just doesn't go for any. Of course, she's a Democrat. Clint is a Republican. They're two very different. They've been canceling each other out now for 40 years. She's a Democrat, and she believes in all the things that Democrats believe in. And he's a Republican, and he believes in personal responsibility, and he believes in respect for the flag, and respect for a lot more than what people have respect for. It's things that have been around for generations. Don't just throw them away. There's no reason for that. He's against big government. He's against big government regulation. He's against the free lunch. The whole idea of it offends him. He is, however, tired of hunting, and he wishes that he could give it up. But then she would take that as a victory. So he goes. He's never cared for venison, and his hip hurts when he walks over uneven ground. And he doesn't like the men he goes hunting with, who are all Republicans too, but they're angry Republicans. And Clint is not an angry Republican. He believes that Republicans are problem solvers, not bellyachers. But these men, they get a couple whiskeys in them, and they just ratchet about everything. Hours and hours. They go on and on. He'd like to get away from it, but he can't. He's condemned to go and hunt. She's been thinking a lot about an old classmate of hers, Kurt, an old boyfriend. Lives out in San Francisco. They keep in touch now by Facebook. He's a Democrat, Kurt. You have to be in San Francisco. Otherwise, live on a very high floor. He believes in all the things that she believes in. And he's very debonair. They talked one night on the phone for 3 hours. And at the end of it, he said, "You ought to fly out here to San Francisco. I'll pay your way. It'd be nice to see you again." She said, "I can't. It would be wrong." "Well, think about it," he said. And she has. for 4 years, especially around election time, and especially during deer hunting season. Well, Pastor Liz was working on her Reformation Sunday sermon, and Clint walked up to the rectory and walked in the back door, and he handed her a newspaper. Here was a story about a couple of robberies. One in Hayward, Wisconsin, a couple had knocked over a bank, and they'd knocked over a convenience store in Hinckley. The description matched the couple who'd brought their child in for baptism. Dark hair, the man with a ponytail that he tucked up under a baseball cap. So, a child is on its way west across America in the company of thieves. What should we do? Said Clint. Should we call the FBI? Oh, she said, I'm sure they're already familiar with this case. No, she said. Grace. Grace. God's unearned generosity, given freely. This is what we believe. This is what Luther believed. You can't earn it. You can't get away from it. So, a child, protected by grace, driving west in the company of thieves, and the two who are responsible for the child are a Republican and a Democrat. God have mercy. That's the news from Lake Wobegon, where all the women are strong, all the men are good looking, all the children are above average.